I first came across this idea of estrogenics and a fertility crisis about 2 or 3 months ago, and it is clear that sperm rates are decreasing. They've decreased like 50% since the 1970s, and also women are experiencing more miscarriages. And one way of looking at why this is happening is through estrogenics. And Hamza gets his source for estrogenics from a book called Estrogeneration by Antony Jay. And in this book, he lists all these different estrogenic substances, and he defines an estrogenic substance as an artificial estrogen which acts like the natural hormone estrogen and binds to estrogen receptors, which is bad for our hormone system because it imbalances it, and obviously this artificial estrogen isn't meant to be there. That's the claim, okay? And I agree with most of that and most of the categories. I think, yeah, if you think about it, the microplastics which are in our water supply and the processed foods that we're eating and all of this new innovation that comes with civilization does have downsides to it. And as I said, this can be one reason for why our health isn't amazing at the moment, especially in terms of hormones. But where there's a bit of controversy is around plant estrogens or phytoestrogens, because they are not artificial. And if you buy into this idea like I do, that potentially these new things that have been introduced to society are harmful, then how are these specific plant estrogens bad for us? Because people have been eating them for hundreds of years, thousands of years perhaps. Are our bodies not adapted to them? Doesn't quite fit with the argument. But I didn't think of this objection at first. After watching one of Hamza's videos, I went and got the ebook online from Estrogeneration by Antony Jay, and it has made it really easy to just copy and paste things that I don't understand, science terms, and Google it, and also look up the studies, because at first I didn't do this, but recently, the last few days, I've really been digging into this and reading all of the studies that the author brings up, and seeing the main issue that I'm trying to bring up here is whether plant estrogens and phytoestrogens are estrogenic. Do they increase estrogen in the body and therefore imbalance our hormones? But I want to start with explaining a bit more about phytoestrogens. The two main foods that have high contents of phytoestrogens are flaxseed and soy. And as soon as I read that, I skimmed the introduction of the book and I read the 10 different substances. And phytoestrogens was at the top, the first one he puts. And then that chapter about it, I read a little bit, and he said soy and flaxseed are the highest. So I thought, okay, simple, I'll just remove them from my diet. But the other day, I was talking to a friend, and I brought this up, saying about how this new knowledge of estrogenics has changed my lifestyle. And he was saying, these artificial estrogens, he didn't even say artificial, but these plant estrogens are not the same biologically to natural estrogen. They don't act in the same way, so there's nothing to worry about. I was like, that never occurred to me. I sort of just believed it as a blanket statement. So, and he also explained to me some context of 4 or 5 years ago. I'm not sure whether the term is still used today, but apparently soy boy was an insult that people would tell each other, probably on Twitter, to as an insult. You know, you'd say you would call someone a soy boy if they're not a full man or a feminine man, who can't build any muscle in the gym because his testosterone is so low because he's drinking soy milk. And I didn't know that this was an insult or anything, but I went home and he was arguing against it. He was saying, okay, you know, it's just fake. It's just, they just made it up. And I watched this very good video debunking it. And then they had a study, which was a meta-analysis. And a meta-analysis is like all of the previous clinical studies put together into one reviewed study. And this was specifically about soy, so not flax as well. But this study claimed that soy has no effect on the male hormone system. So there, my mind had almost completely been changed, right? I had thought, oh, these plant estrogens, I'll take them out of my diet because they're estrogenic and estrogenic substances are bad. And now I see the study that shows that there's no impacts on the male hormones. At this point, I decided to look back at the book by Antony Jay and try to fully understand where he was coming from. I wanted to go back and look at Estrogeneration because it seemed strange to me that the author has written this category into the list of harmful estrogenic substances, phytoestrogens. And that's the premise of his whole book, that these substances are making us infertile and obese and unhealthy. So why is it there if it's just plain wrong? I wanted to see his full argument because I just skimmed it before. And as I said, because I got it in ebook form, it made it really easy to just look at the citations he's made and look at the studies online and see whether what he is saying about the studies is an accurate representation. So I'm going to go through a few studies with you, the ones, some of the ones that he cites himself, and then studies that I found of my own accord, often through citations within the studies that he cites himself. But before I do that, I've got an important thing to add. Which has just escaped me. Oh yeah, for all of the different estrogenic substances, he gives proof of estrogenic behavior. Apart from phytoestrogens, he says, I don't feel obliged to give proof of estrogenic behavior because estrogen is in the name, phytoestrogen. Okay, but if they were estrogenic, and there were plenty of studies to show they were estrogenic, it would also be very easy for you to just cite it and prove that they're estrogenic. And it turns out it's not as simple as that. It's not as simple as these plant estrogens are estrogenic, which is what we're going to get to now. Okay. The first study that I looked at from the book is a research paper where researchers analysed the contents of over 100 foods to test what foods are the highest in phytoestrogen content. And this is where I got the fact that flax is the highest concentrated food which has phytoestrogens in, and then it's soy. Flax has about 4 times as much. But also importantly, they're both phytoestrogens, but they're made up of different things. Flax is made up of these things called lignans, and soy is made up of this thing called isoflavones. And this is important because they act in different ways. They're digested in different ways, and they have a different impact on the body. So the way we assess them needs to be different as well. So Antony Jay does concede to some extent, and he says that these lignans, which are present in flaxseed, that is, the majority of their phytoestrogen content are in these lignans, are actually beneficial. He says there's a few studies which show that they prevent certain diseases and are healthy. And one of the things that he cites, I'm going to quote from the book here, he says, in the 1980s, scientists found that lignans decrease free testosterone, but they were more specifically investigating enterolactone, a breakdown product of lignan. And then he cites a study. And the study is the effect of lignans and phytoestrogens. And in the title is also sex hormone binding globulin. And a common theme which will come up as I go through these studies is that he cites these studies and they do not favour his argument that phytoestrogens are estrogenic. So in this one that he cites, which includes the sex hormone binding globulin, it says, and I quote, that there is a significant correlation between the intake of fibre and urinary excretion of lignans and phytoestrogens and the concentration of plasma SHBG. SHBG is sex hormone binding globulin, and I watched a very informative YouTube video about this globulin, and it is important that we have enough of this sex hormone binding globulin. If you have too much, that leads to problems. If you have too little, that leads to problems as well. But what it does is it binds to hormones, basically. It binds to testosterone and it binds to estrogen. And the most potent form of, or the most common hormone type of estrogen is estradiol. And what happens when this globulin binds to it is that these hormones cannot disassociate from the globulin, and it cannot be freed. The hormones cannot freely be used in the body and in the cell and in cells because it's binded to this globulin instead. So what does this mean? It means when sex hormone binding globulin increases, both free testosterone and free estradiol decreases. Free means bioavailable in the body. It means that these hormones are able to be used. So there's a big difference between total testosterone and free testosterone. Free testosterone is really more important because that's the testosterone that can be used in your body. So this does not favour Antony Jay's argument that, in this case, flax seeds are estrogenic because the lignans in them correlate to the concentration of the sex hormone binding globulin. And when there's more sex hormone binding globulin, both free testosterone and free estradiol goes down. And the idea of an estrogenic substance is that it increases estrogen and it decreases testosterone. So clearly it's a bit more complex than this because both of these hormones are decreasing in this study that he cites himself. The next thing he says in this chapter is that our intestinal bacteria, it seems, the gut bacteria, the good probiotics, break down lignans into all sorts of products with long, complicated names. And he cites a study. And the study is assessing exposure to lignans and their metabolites in humans. Metabolites are the broken down bits of the primary thing. And here the study is actually in favour, somewhat in favour, because it says phytoestrogens are structurally similar to estrogens, can bind to estrogen receptors, and elicit a weak estrogenic response. Emphasis on weak. The study is not saying that having this will absolutely mess up your hormone system. It's saying there's a weak estrogenic response. Estrogen might increase slightly. And then, importantly, it also says observational and intervention studies in humans have suggested that lignan consumption is associated with favourable effects on hormone levels and metabolism and reductions in risk of cardiovascular disease, osteoporosis, diabetes, and renal disease. So clearly there are advantages to having flaxseed. And this is probably one of the reasons that the author had to concede somewhat and say that lignans and flax aren't all bad. He does later go in and dig hard into soy, more so than flax, which also doesn't make quite as much sense because flax is 4 times more concentrated in phytoestrogens than soy is. And that's his main concern here. Yet he digs more into soy. Arguably because soy has less of these favourable health effects regarding cardiovascular disease, etc. But there are some advantages to soy as well. From this study, this is one that he hasn't cited himself, but I found, I think through the previous study or perhaps somewhere else. This study is called Role of Accurate Methodology in Demonstrating the Safety and Efficacy of Phytoestrogens. And I quote, the anti-estrogenic activity of phytoestrogens may be partially explained by their competition with endogenous estradiol for estrogen receptors. So this is completely different to what Antony Jay has said and what the previous study said. The previous study said it may elicit a weak estrogenic response. And this one straight away is explaining why it's anti-estrogenic. And to me, it makes sense. It's saying that the phytoestrogens compete with the endogenous, meaning inside the body, estradiol. Remember, estradiol is the main hormone of estrogen. It competes with the estrogen for estrogen receptors, meaning how I would see it is that if you ingest a lot of phytoestrogens, there could potentially be more phytoestrogens than the actual hormone, estrogen, meaning that the phytoestrogens bind to the receptors instead of estrogen. Therefore, estrogen can't be used in the body, and it decreases. The next important thing that is spoken about in the study is that large doses of these compounds are generally considered to be anti-estrogenic in presence of endogenous estrogen, but estrogenic in the absence of estrogen, in brackets, postmenopausal women. So this is where it gets somewhat more complicated, and perhaps this is a reason why there are contradictions. Some studies saying that there's a weak estrogenic response, and some saying it's both. There's sometimes this study is saying that sometimes there's a weak response and sometimes there's an anti-estrogenic response. And it's saying it's depending on the hormones already present in the body. So for people who already have endogenous estrogen in them, the ingestion of phytoestrogens generally means that they are anti-estrogenic, that estrogen will decrease because, like I said before, they're competing for the estrogen receptors. But in postmenopausal women who do not have as much estrogen, presumably, I'm extrapolating, it doesn't say this, but from what I can understand from the quote, is that the phytoestrogens bind to the estrogen receptors, and because they're so chemically similar, they do act in some similar way to estrogen and give an estrogenic response, because there's no actual estrogen hormone present in the body, or not as much. Another quote I'm going to give. However, adverse effects of consumption of large amounts of phytoestrogens, such as fertility problems, reproductive failure, and abnormal early development, has been reported in animals. And this is one of the arguments that I saw in favor of this soy boy idea. When I watched this debunking video, they explained that this fitness influencer took these studies that were saying that phytoestrogens are estrogenic in animals and then generalized that to humans. And the debunker rightly said that humans are different to animals, and if the animal study is on sheep, for example, their digestion system is very different because they have 3 or 4 stomachs. And that's a good objection. But at the end of the day, although we are different to animals in some way, we are also similar to animals in some way. We are mammals. So you've got to, position yourself somewhere in the middle. And this is the end of the author's contribution to flax and other phytoestrogen substances, but this is all he has to say about flax, really. And he says, I try not to consume high contents of flax because of their high estrogenic behavior, but because of the lignans having some good health benefits, I do eat them occasionally. But he, as I said earlier, he digs a lot more into soy, which is what we're going to get into now. There's another study that I haven't mentioned, which I want to talk about briefly. And the study is called Inhibition of Human Aromatase by Mammalian Lignans and Isoflavonoid Phytoestrogens. And when I saw the words inhibition of human aromatase, that sort of rang a bell, because I've seen previous videos in the past about aromatase inhibition, and I was pretty sure that increases testosterone levels. And I looked up about it, and it's right, because aromatase converts testosterone into estrogen. So when there's an inhibition of aromatase, which is an enzyme, by the way, when there's an inhibition of that, i.e. there's less of it, there's less testosterone being converted to estrogen, meaning more stays as testosterone and less is made into estrogen. In other words, this lowers estrogen levels and increases testosterone levels, which is the reverse of what an estrogenic substance should do, in theory. So this is another good example of Antony Jay, sort of making this all up. So at this point, I had originally believed Antony Jay and thought, yep, phytoestrogens are bad, I'm not going to eat them. And then I spoke to a friend, saw this debunking video, a few debunking videos, and this meta-analysis saying that soy is absolutely fine. And I thought, okay, I was wrong, my bad. And now, having gone back to the book itself and looking in depth at the studies that he cites, it seems that he was making points about the studies to fit his argument, but didn't realize that when you actually look at the study yourself, they go against his estrogenic argument. So he was not using an estrogenic argument when citing the studies. He was saying, okay, these lignans are broken down into various different compounds or molecules, and then he cited that, but he didn't realize that in that cited study it says that they're not estrogenic, or that it's more complicated. Some do say that they're estrogenic, but it's also depends on the hormones in the body as to whether it's a weak estrogenic effect or an anti-estrogenic effect. And by the way, all of these studies I'm going to put in a Google Doc or something. I can put it in the description for you guys, so you can check and read all of these yourself if you would like to. So after reading, at the end of that first chapter about phytoestrogens, he says that he's going to come back to them and also write a chapter which is relevant to all estrogenics, which is bias and spin, and how research is taking place, how scientific journals work, how the peer review process works, how valid these studies are effectively. And he is arguing that these studies are not valid because of bias and spin, because either the government funds these specific studies and wants a certain conclusion to be found, or companies who sell soy and flax. But he's not specifically talking about that in this chapter. He's talking about all estrogenic products, so plastics and fungicides, pesticides, birth control, all of these supposed estrogenic substances, he's saying are mostly being tested from funding from these companies or from the government. And if it is from the government is influenced by those companies. So he's giving a very Andrew Tate matrix idea here. And I'm going to quote a little bit and give the studies in the description too. He talks about this researcher called Dr. Nestle, not from the company Nestle who do Smarties or whatever, but that's what the doctor's name is. And I quote, "She has found 168 corporate-funded studies, and guess what? Only 12 of those 168 studies find that results are unfavorable toward the company products. 156 are favorable." So this is talking about the company funding the research as a way to get results to prove that their products are beneficial and healthy to the population. And here's another quote I'm going to give. In a 2011 survey of 2,000 research psychologists, over half admitted to selectively reporting those experiments that gave the result they were after. So this is not company bias anymore, but personal researcher bias. That if you're trying to find a certain conclusion and you research, they're saying over half selectively report on the experiments, meaning like from this sample size of 2,000, more than half of them deliberately lied for their own means, essentially. And I can object to some extent to this because this is about psychologists and psychology and not quite about medicine or the effects of food. The next quite shocking quote I have from this section of the chapter is that he says, "For example, not long ago I was eating lunch with a top executive from a huge biotech company. He shall remain nameless. The exec told me, whenever people within our drug company read something in a science journal about an amazing new drug or treatment, we first attempt to repeat that research in our own labs. Even if the paper was published in a top science journal, we first repeat it, without replicating the experiments in-house. We would otherwise waste millions of dollars trying to create a drug based entirely on a faulty experiment published in a journal. I estimate," he went on, "that over 50% of the time we cannot repeat published study findings." He was referring to professionally published scientific research studies. So this is, again, very shocking, and it is evidence for an untruthful scientific journal process where this big company, this big pharmaceutical company, sees that something beneficial and positive has been written in a journal, tries to repeat the experiment, and they can't repeat it. So therefore, something has gone wrong here. But my objection to this is that this is in Antony Jay's own words. He could be making all of this up, this quote specifically, because he's saying he met this exec for lunch. Did you? Where's your evidence for that? It's a story, and he may also be overemphasizing the numbers. We don't know who this exec is. There's no, there's no sort of accountability put on him because, anybody could make up the story, but it still is shocking, which is probably why he put it in his book. We shall continue. Now we move on to, I haven't talked about the peer review process. He also talks about the peer review process and how it's not very good because not only are scientists trying to pump out as many studies as possible to try and get a pay rise, to try and get more grants from companies and the government, they they befriend people in their in their work life as scientists, they befriend people at conferences, and then when they submit a article to a journal, to a science journal, the journal often requests the author of the research to put forward a few names to peer review the research paper. So what Antony Jay is arguing is that when scientists write a research paper, they put their friends down, their close colleague friends down to peer review it. And then when they receive the peer review, those colleagues can see the name of the author. They can see, oh, it's my friend Jeff from the conference a month ago, and he's written this study and I've got to peer review it. And even if you're trying not to be biased, it's a part of human nature that you're going to favor your friends. And I'm sure Antony Jay's argument is that they're not trying to be biased. They obviously see that their friend is on there and they're in this kind of loop where if you peer review my study, then can you do this one? Or, giving favors to each other to help them get these studies through the system, because it's a very competitive landscape. And that was quite shocking to hear from me, that these journal articles themselves actually request the author to put forward names to peer review it, instead of it just being random. At university, my essays are anonymous. They're marked anonymously. So there's no favors like, oh, I like Daniel the most, so I'm going to give him the top mark. They don't know whose work they're writing. And that's the right way to do it, because there's no bias involved. So at this point, this was quite a big shame for me, I think, because I didn't want to... I'd read all of these studies, all of these different studies talking about the complex nature of phytoestrogens in regards to whether they're estrogenic or not. And it's not as simple as they're all estrogenic. There are different situations which cause different results. And then I hear this from Antony Jay and I'm thinking, anybody could say this about anything, Any movement which is trying to break away from the mainstream way of living, and mainstream companies and mainstream media, etc., could use this technique of saying it's all bias and spin, it's all the matrix. But then where is the objective truth anywhere? All of the studies that he mentioned previously about lignans and about flax and how there are some benefits in preventing cardiovascular disease, maybe that's bias as well. So when you put that in, I felt like Antony Jay was undermining all of the studies that he's put in. He's saying how the whole process is terrible. Well, then why are you citing anything? And he does have an answer to it, which is that you have to be really careful with what you read, essentially. But this does favor his argument, because he's saying, what he says is, if you know something can be bought and sold in mass and can be made and can be highly profitable, then you've got to be wary of the scientific studies on them. And he also says, do not rely on one study for your whole understanding. It's got to be multiple different studies. And what I would add on to that is that I haven't gone to this extreme length of finding the truth, but you could look at the scientific journal articles, look at if you could look at who peer-reviewed it and how they're related to the author, that would be very beneficial. I would like to know that the peer reviewers are anonymous and aren't allied in some way to the author. And also, it's important to know who funded the research, because I think there is some truth to say that big biotech companies are funding research for products that they're selling themselves to prove that they are healthy. But now we will move on to his dig into soy specifically. That previous part I've just spoken about was about bias and spin for all of the estrogenic products, like fungicides and pesticides, all of and plastics, BPA, phthalates, all of these things being harmful to us. And as I said at the start, I agree with most of it, that most of these things are bad, but doesn't make sense with plants because they are not artificial. They have not been introduced recently. Okay, here we go. We're diving directly into soy here. If you remember at the start, I talked about a study which showed that a meta-analysis which showed that soy has little or no effect on male hormones, on testosterone and male fertility. And Antony Jay puts forward this 2002 paper. As soon as I heard 2002, I thought that's too long ago, really. But the title is Goitrogenic and Estrogenic Activity of Soy Isoflavones. And one of the first sentences in the study is, soy is known to produce estrogenic isoflavones. Here we briefly review the evidence for binding of isoflavones to the estrogen receptor in vivo, which means in body, estrogenicity, and developmental toxicity, and estrogen developmental carcinogenesis in rats. And what carcinogenesis, I probably said that wrong. What that means is the creation of cancer cells. So they were looking at, does soy isoflavones create cancer cells in rats? And Antony Jay was saying, oh, this is really scary. And they're talking about goiter as well. And goiter is this growth that can happen on the throat, which is also a serious health issue. And this was being researched in 2002. And then he's saying, but now soy is a massive billion-dollar company, and being, it's got $1 billion market, and these top food companies, if you can call them food companies, he calls them processing companies, because they don't actually do anything to the food other than process it highly and put it in plastic, which is also estrogenic. He's saying that all of this is just a scam, basically, and that it's been, in 2002 it was being researched about whether it causes cancer and goiter, and now it's being claimed as a health food. So that is worrying. But the study itself does not say that it directly causes cancer or goiter. That's just what they were looking into. He does give some credible arguments, because I haven't spoken about a study that talks about favorable isoflavone strengthening bones, and that paper was from 2015 in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. And he says that the fact that this paper on cancer and goiter was written in 2002, but this favorable one that was written in 2015 was written then, the reason that is important is that in that period of time, the bias and spin has been applied. So he's arguing that earlier studies should be looked at with more consideration because there was less media influence and less money being pumped into science, is his argument. And that's a decent argument, I suppose. But when you're looking back to the 1960s, like he is, for problems with goiter in human infants being attributed to soy, I think 1960 is too far back to reliably know that their testing methods were accurate, and our advancement in science and measuring techniques must have improved a lot since 1960. I don't think you can go that far back. So that is the objection to this argument of money and spin. One, it's the idea that, okay, can we trust anything? And also the idea that, there's the methods of testing were not as good back then. Of course, he would say, yeah, they're not as good, but now they're better and they're being used against us. The final paper that he cites, I actually like. I think it's really informative. And I don't really understand why he's cited it. He says, this 2014 science paper is a review, an overview of research on this topic. The paper is titled Soy Foods and Supplementation, a review of commonly perceived health benefits and risks. And then he says, in this paper, the authors only focus on 5 health risks from eating soy products, namely increased risk of breast cancer, male hormonal and fertility problems, hypothyroidism, anti-nutrient content, and harmful processing byproducts. And then he says, again, this is 2014, things have gotten bleaker, not better, in agenda-free soy research between 2002 and 2014. It's a mess. And that's how he ends the chapter. Okay, so he omits an important part of the study, this review, which I recommend you read. I'm going to go over it now, because he only talks about the risks. And again, it's like the goiter and cancer argument. They're just looking at whether those risks exist. They're not proving that they are correlated. And crucially, they talk about 5 benefits to soy as well. So he's really just quoting it in a one-sided manner. But this review has over 100 citations and studies that it looks at. So I'm going to quote a few things from it, and then I'm going to wrap up and give you my conclusion. And I quote, the evidence on male fertility and reproductive hormones was conflicting. Some studies demonstrated a deleterious impact caused by soy consumption, and others showed no effect. So saying it's conflicting. It's not one or the other. And I'd like to point out that this review, at the end of the review, it says that it had no financial funding, that it was privately sponsored. It wasn't funded by a company or the government. So this counters, or this, how can I say this? It complements Antony Jay's idea of bias and spin, meaning this isn't as biased and spun as the company-funded studies and the government-funded studies, because this is privately sponsored. There'll still be some bias, but this is good as far as Antony Jay is concerned, and yet he still omits the 5 health benefits, but there we go. The authors found that consuming moderate amounts of traditionally prepared and minimally processed soy foods may offer modest health benefits while minimizing potential for adverse health effects. I put emphasis on may there because, again, it isn't conclusive. It doesn't show that there is a link. The next thing, so this review is very much on the fence, which I think is good because we can extract our own opinion from it. Soy is nearly omnipresent in processed foods today, and consuming soy is essentially unavoidable unless one takes a concerted effort to read labels carefully. Thus, the impact of soy on human health warrants careful public health consideration. It also says that soy was originally not eaten in Asia. It was first used for nitrogen storing properties so that rice could be grown in each alternate year, because rice takes all the nitrogen out of the soil, and then when you grow soy, that brings nitrogen back to the soil, so rice can be grown again the following year. Soy was only eaten once bacterial fermentation alleviated digestion difficulties. So this can somewhat make sense in terms of an evolution or adaptation argument, because soy was not originally eaten because it wasn't able to be digested properly. However, before the massive processing of modern food companies making protein, soy protein powder, and soy chocolate bars and other things that are really processed and wrapped in plastic, before that, there was soy sauce and other things which were present in Asian diets. So it's a bit of both here. It's sort of in the middle. You know, it's soy wasn't originally eaten by everybody, but then soy sauce was, well, somewhat, and only recently has the processing got a bit ridiculous. The FDA labels soy a health food due to the link that it decreases coronary heart disease, but this is only when having a low saturated diet, which is often overlooked. And then there was an interesting point saying, due to the FDA approval of health claims and the resulting marketing of soy as a health food, frequent soy consumption is generally observed in vegetarian populations and other groups of health-conscious individuals. Thus, consumers of soy are likely to lead healthier lifestyles than those who do not consume soy. Very interesting. Do you understand that? So because the FDA labels it healthy, more healthy people are going to eat that food. And then when you test the people who eat soy to see whether it's healthy or not, the people are already on average more healthy. So that could be another bias, potentially. And as I put in my notes, I've put, this review seems very legit because it has over 100 citations. It's not a single study or a single meta-analysis. It's not funded by anybody specifically. It's privately sponsored. It gives really good information, not just about male fertility, but the other risks and health benefits. Some of the one of the health benefits that I haven't spoken about, but is in some of the studies that I'm going to link, is that soy and phytoestrogens are beneficial in alleviating menopausal symptoms in women. Because if you remember earlier, one of the studies explained that in postmenopausal women, they have less estrogen, and therefore these phytoestrogens act in a way which increases the estrogen, and that alleviates different menopausal symptoms like hot flushes. So clearly soy can be useful, and flax, I mean, Antony Jay really didn't dig into flax at all, even though, as I say, again, for the third time probably, flax is 4 times more concentrated in phytoestrogens than soy. There were some studies saying that soy and flax are estrogenic, but slightly more said that they're not estrogenic, and then a few said that they're, it's more complicated, and it depends on the hormone levels in the body. In terms of bias and spin, however, soy definitely makes a lot more money than flax. So perhaps that's why there have been single study meta-analysis. And I know it's a meta-analysis, but they had maybe 7 or 8 studies compared to this review that I've just spoken about, which had maybe 100 citations. This one that had 7 or 8, it did seem to me that it was very much debunking the soy boy argument directly. They were saying in the abstract, it said that in the public consciousness, there's been an idea that soy feminizes men. Now that to me clearly shows that they somewhat have an agenda to try and prove that wrong. But there's bias in everything. It's very difficult to try and get to the objective truth. Very difficult. So lignans seem healthy in flax seeds. I think overall, the science does generally explain that estrogenic foods, phytoestrogens, I've only talked about soy and flax here, but lavender, artificial lavender, not the actual pure lavender plant, but fragrances that are in a lavender, how do I explain it, that are very similar to lavender, are estrogenic apparently, and also cannabis is estrogenic. And I haven't talked about that because I don't think it's as prevalent in our lives as flax and soy, but maybe I could look into it in the future. The science is on the side of these companies, these supposed companies that are funding the research, explaining that these things are healthy. Okay? And you might think, okay, of course, that's because they're getting funded by them. But again, I go back to the point, how can we know anything about science is true? Any scientific studies? You have to look in such great detail at who wrote it, who peer-reviewed it, who funded it, what journal is it written in, is there any bias? Is the researcher biased? Is the researcher on the board for soy products or flax products? Really tough. I would say soy can be used by postmenopausal women to prevent menopausal symptoms. I think that seems reasonable, despite the potential estrogenic negatives. I mean, it's not even a negative. You want it to be estrogenic at that point, don't you? Because you want the increase in estrogen. For everybody else, you don't really want estrogenic effects because it does change your hormone your hormone system and can lead to infertility. But the question is, are they estrogenic? And the science is not, it's not really there. It's not really improving it. You have to leave everything down to this bias and spin argument, which may be true, but it's just really hard to know. There is no definitive answer here. I'm in a fortunate position because I am happy eating meat. I enjoy eating meat, so I can use that as my main protein source, as opposed to vegetarians and vegans who do often use soy as their main protein source. So, and flax I used to use in protein shakes, so I probably will continue to not use anymore. Better safe than sorry, I would say. I know it seems like, oh, I'm just not trusting in the science. Better safe than sorry is all I can say. I'm fortunate that I'm able to have other substitutes. The main thing that I want to bring out of this video is that it is so important that we're skeptical about the different things that we see online and that we read and we digest. I think lots of the information that we see, I mean, in terms of algorithms on YouTube, we see things which are already created in a way to suit our point of view. And it's likely that we're going to agree with most of what we see on social media, because that's what the algorithm gives us. That's what we want to see. We get given what we want. So it's important that we are critical. And I did, originally when I first read this book and saw Hamza's video, I saw, okay, these things are estrogenic and I'm not going to use them, okay? And then the reason that I've specifically gone in depth to phytoestrogens, the plant estrogens, is because after having that conversation with my friend, I thought, okay, and seeing the meta-analysis, I was like, okay, the soy clearly doesn't have an effect on the male fertility and things. And then I looked more in depth, especially because from an evolution argument, plant estrogens weren't introduced recently. They're not artificial like plastics and everything else. That's why I wanted to investigate it first, because it seems out of place from that argument. And I have somewhat blindly agreed with most of everything else that Antony Jay has spoken about in his book, but that does align with my idea of processed foods being bad, and it seems quite obvious to me that plastics, microplastics, and other things in our environment that are artificial to us are harming our health. But in the future, I think I am going to look more in depth and read his book in full and look at the studies and see specifically whether these things are harmful or not. An interesting one that I will probably research next is birth control and contraceptives, because I haven't read the chapter, but I've seen it briefly, that his argument is that there are so many women on the contraceptive pill and that the hormone can't get broken down. So when they urinate, it goes into the waste system. And when all of the waste gets turned back into clean, drinkable tap water, definitely get a water filter. If you don't believe the idea, which I was just about to talk about, where there is estrogen in our water from these contraceptives, there's definitely microplastics and chlorine in the water. So, like, get a water filter. So I'll probably research that next, because I think it's quite controversial and would be interesting to see what the actual studies say. Okay. That is all I have, I think. I hope this video has been interesting and you have found out why you should be skeptical about things that you see online and things that you read that you're interested in, because there might be a hidden agenda somewhere, and it's always good to try and be rational and think things through yourself. Thank you for watching this video, and I will see you in the next one. Have a great rest of your day.